I have a day job as an instructional designer, but that also plays into what I do with Sound on Sound and various other publications and organizations. And that's just a little bit about my history and credentials. And I've been restoring Fairlights with Peter now for about a decade, but I've had a lifelong obsession with them. And because of that, I've done plenty of research and managed to ingratiate myself with many of the people that worked at the organization at the time. And so have been very fortunate to get lots of firsthand stories and recollections of what was going on and how things worked and how it all kind of came together. So what I want to kind of go through with you today is just a little bit about the history of the Fairlight CMI and how it came into being, who were the key players, and talk a little bit about its influence and impact upon music technology, pop music, popular culture, and so on. And towards the end, there's a kind of an interesting tale of how a single Fairlight kicked off some very important musical pieces and genres in the early 1980s. And maybe it's something you can take away from this and go and listen to and you know, piece that thread together yourself, because it's quite an interesting one. So the Fairlight CMI, I mean, some people will probably know it as a musical instrument. You have one at the university, and in 1980, when it first really kind of became a known thing, not many people really knew what to do with it and how it worked. It seemed like magic, and one of the first kind of sightings of a Fairlight in the UK, anyway, was on popular television science program Tomorrow's World. And those of you who are similar in age to myself will probably remember Thursday nights, sat down after dinner. Tomorrow's World was on at 7, Top of the Pops at 7:30. It was an hour of brilliant entertainment. And I remember seeing Kieran Prendeville on Tomorrow's World demonstrate this. And
this is the BBC Home Service.
Here's a little bit of what he says.
Presents You're Nicked.
And so he proceeds to do a lot of Foley work in the old traditional sense. And then you'll go on to replicate that on a Fairlight. It's a fairly long video, so we'll skip past that one. But one of the important things to point out, and that video is available on YouTube for you to go and watch at your leisure, is that Kieran describes what the Fairlight does completely incorrectly, which is very surprising for a scientific television program. And he describes it as the Fairlight computing the sound completely itself. So he uses a demonstration sound of a timpani drum, and he has a timpani in the studio. He has a mini Moog, which has been programmed to sound a bit like a timpani drum. And then he goes to the Fairlight and he plays the note on the Fairlight, and it sounds exactly like a timpani drum. However, he describes this as being completely created within the computer, and this is not true. And it's one of the biggest misconceptions about the Fairlight that, I recently saw a video online where they claimed it was a physical modeling synthesizer, and it is anything but. But it did start out as something completely different to a sampler, and I'm going to explain how that came about. So in the beginning, there were two gentlemen from Sydney. Kim Ryrie, who was the owner of a computer magazine, computer technology magazine, part work kind of thing, and they even created their own synthesizer that you could, each month you got the magazine that told you what to do and what components to buy, and you could build your own synthesizer. But he wanted to do more, and he was fully aware of digital technology at the time and thought there must be a way that we can create a fantastic musical instrument using digital technology. How do we do this? Well, he remembered a guy at school called Breathy Vocal, who was a kind of friend at the time, but he knew that he was a bit of a mad inventor. And so he called Peter and said, look, I want to make this ultimate digital synthesizer that can make acoustic sounds without ever going close to a trumpet or a violin or an oboe or a flute. What do you think? And Pete says, yeah, that sounds great. Let's get to it. So they start designing a digital synthesizer, and they decided to use additive synthesis as the basis for which to create these sounds. And additive synthesis using fast Fourier transform means you create what we call partials, either harmonic or inharmonic tones, and then you layer those together in certain combinations, and you start to get an approximation of a sound. And that was the plan, was that they could analyze acoustic audio, recreate those partials within the computer, and have the computer process all of those in real time and deliver something that they were looking for. And they failed miserably. At the same time, this gentleman was doing similar work in Canberra at the School of Music in Canberra, and his name is Tony Furs, and he was doing pretty much the same thing. He was trying to use additive synthesis to recreate acoustic sounds, and he too wasn't succeeding. This is his second instrument, the Quasar 1. I cannot find pictures of it anywhere. I think only one existed, and it's probably been long dismantled. But this is the Quasar 2. And again, not many examples existed, but as you can see, it's a rather odd looking machine. And everything was done through additive synthesis, and it didn't sound particularly great. And this is a clip that, again, you can find on YouTube called Lindsay Blue Plays the Quasar. And apart from being rather bizarre to watch, you'll hear in the first few seconds here how awful it actually sounds. Now, I'm not sure how good that quality came through to you, but it's painful, really, really painful. But it's amusing to watch, particularly because of the clothes that these guys are wearing at that particular time. It's very kind of pipe and slippers and scarves around the necks, and very 70s. But yeah, they were failing, basically. Peter Vogel and Kim Rari in Sydney and Tony Furs in Canberra were trying to do this thing. And through Tony's contacts with RCA, he was a consultant with RCA in Australia, he learned of a new microprocessor called the Motorola 6800. And this was being lauded as a real breakthrough in computer processing technology. And so he was able to get some examples of these processors and started building a computer. He thought an actual computer could be a better way of creating these sounds. And he came up with the concept of a light pen and screen, which, of course, if you're familiar with the Fairlight, was something, it was one of its key features, the thing that most people remember. And he implemented the 6800 processor in a very unique way. In fact, he used two of them in parallel. And this meant that he could effectively multitask and switch between the two processors and have one doing one job and another doing another. And it just improved the whole speed of the machine. So these pictures that you see here, this is Tony on the left here, stood by a machine that's called the Quasar M8. And the M8 stands for multimode 8. So it was it had 8 voices, 8 monophonic voices that could be played polyphonically. And it's, as you can see on the picture on the right, there's a keyboard and a monitor there, just to give you a sense of scale. This is a very large machine. Now, for those of you that have hopefully had a look at or play with the CMI that you have there at Keele, you might begin to recognize the layout of this machine. So on the left-hand side, you have kill switches and baud rate dials and various buttons for resetting the machine. And on the right-hand side, you have a couple of 8-inch floppy disk drives. So to put that into perspective, those drives are 8 inches tall. So you've probably got another 6 inches above and below. So this is a rather hefty, heavy machine. And it was getting a bit closer to what they wanted to achieve, but still wasn't hitting the mark. And Rari and Vogel got wind of Tony's work in Canberra, took a trip down to the School of Music and met with Tony Furs and said, look, we're trying to do the same thing, and we hear that you're having a bit more success using these new processors. Can we license your technology? And we'll take that away to Sydney, you'll get paid, and we'll see if we can improve upon it. And so they agreed a licensing deal. And this is at the point where Tony kind of drops out of the story, but he must never be forgotten as, you know, he was a very important part in the genesis of the machine. So the guys go back to Sydney and they open up this box and see that it is completely wire wrapped. So there's no PCBs, there's no IC chips. It's all wires and diodes and capacitors, and it's a complete bird's nest. So they go about coming up with a design that makes it more practical to use and smaller in its form. And this was their first attempt, the Quasar CMI. And this now looks much more like a traditional Fairlight that we know and love. And in fact, you can see, you know, the wooden end panels there was soon replaced by metal panels. But yeah, this is essentially the birth of the CMI, the computer music instrument. But of course, this was still doing additive synthesis. Internally, it looked like this. So you had, you know, your two drives on the right-hand side, and then a set of PCBs that slotted into a motherboard, behind which is the audio output section. And on the left-hand side, you can see the Coca-Cola can-sized capacitors, which was the power supply. So this system ran quite warm, shall we say. But this was the first generation of the CMI, and it had its own screen, its light pen, its alphanumeric keyboard. And this was the genesis of the machine. But of course, it was still doing additive synthesis, and it still wasn't achieving what they wanted to achieve. And then one day, as Peter told me, he happened upon the idea of recording the sound of an acoustic instrument as a way of actually ticking the box on the list of things they wanted this machine to do. Now, analog to digital converters and digital to analog converters were not off-the-shelf products back in, you know, the mid to late 70s. So Peter had to build his own components, which he did. And then he recorded initially a sample of a dog barking, the very famous dog bark, and was able to play that back from RAM using the CMI as a system to process that. And he then realized that what he could do is he could alter the pitch by changing the clock speed of the processor. So by speeding this, you know, the processor up, the pitch goes up, and by slowing it down, the pitch goes down. So he had kind of sorted that issue of playing notes in a chromatic scale. But one thing he noticed is that when he moved the sample 2 or 3 semitones either side of the root note, that he got digital aliasing, digital noise in the sound, and this wasn't pleasant. So then he had to come up with a way of fixing this, and he did this by using a traditional analog low pass filter. And so this would allow the main body of the sound to come through and then roll off the high frequencies where the digital aliasing was taking place. But of course, as you move up and down the keyboard, the aliasing changes in its quality. It gets louder, uses higher frequencies or lower frequencies. So the filter had to dynamically adjust for every single note that was played. So he wrote the code and managed to get this filter to predict in real time, as the note was being played, exactly how much filter needed to be, cutoff needed to be applied to remove those frequencies that were causing the aliasing. Now, of course, that didn't go without affecting the main body of the sound a little bit. And that's the character of the sampling feature of the Fairlight CMI. So what I really want you to appreciate is this is mid-1970s with a couple of guys working literally in a garage in Sydney, Australia, who have come up with the concept of taking analog audio, converting it into a digital piece of data, storing that in RAM, playing it back from the RAM and reconverting it from digital to analog, being able to track the pitch across the keyboard, and also to dynamically filter out the aliasing on every single note that is played. So this is pretty, I mean, it's groundbreaking stuff, but it's amazing that this wasn't happening in a laboratory somewhere. It probably was, but it certainly wasn't being thought of in a commercial sense. So they worked on this and they finished up designing what we now know as the Fairlight CMI, and this is the Series 1. So the Series 1 was the first iteration, and they took it to a number of trade shows, such as AES on the East Coast of America and to NAMM on the West Coast. And they even told their salespeople not to mention the sampling, because they were one part ashamed because they felt like they cheated and not achieved their goal. And they didn't think it was that good, and they didn't want to be laughed out of the exhibition hall. Who knew that it would be the absolute selling point of this machine, and it would go on to change the face of popular music forevermore. So the original Series 1 CMI came, as you can see here in this picture here, the mainframe unit, the VDU with the light pen, the alphanumeric keyboard, and the standard 76-note music keyboard. The slave keyboard that you see on top here was an optional extra, and are unfortunately quite rare. We don't see many of those come through, and when we do, they sell for very high amounts of money because they're quite sought after. So that's the Series 1, and it launched in November of 1979. The first person to buy one was Stevie Wonder, and that's no surprise because Stevie pretty much gets #1 of all fancy new machines. He kind of gets first dibs, and the story goes basically that Peter Vogel, his next door neighbor, was a lady called Mrs. Jackson, and Mrs. Jackson's son Bruce was Elvis Presley's musical director. In 1977, of course, the king passes away, and Bruce comes back to Australia unemployed, and his mother says to him, "Oh, you want to go and see Peter? He's doing something musical in his garage." Bruce goes to see the CMI, is blown away by what it does, and says, "Right, if you want to sell this thing, you're going to need to get it in front of all of these people, and I can get you in front of them." So Bruce was also a pilot. So they flew to America with the CMI. They loaded it into a small prop plane and did a whistle stop tour around LA and across to New York and various other dealers and distributors demonstrating the Fairlight. Stevie saw it in LA, loved it, ordered one, paid a hefty deposit, even took the prototype on stage in Madison Square Garden, and became user #1. They flew across to the East Coast, where Larry Fast saw one of these, phoned up Peter Gabriel in the UK and said, "You've got to hear this machine. I think you'll love it." Peter Gabriel then invites Peter Vogel over to the UK. And of course, that trip happens. And Peter Vogel says, "Right, we're going to set a company up in the UK called Syco Systems, SYCO, and we will distribute these in the UK and Europe." And that company lasted for many years beyond the life of the Fairlight as well, selling high-end musical and production equipment to the well-heeled and the industry itself. So let's move to 1982. So the next iteration of the CMI emerges, and this is the Series 2. So we've had some improvements in terms of memory capacity and processor speeds. We've had some audio improvements. The floppy disk drives are now half width, so they take up less space, although effectively with the shrouds around them, they're still quite hefty, but there's a bit more air to move around and let the system breathe. And by this time, any use of the additive feature was really very, very rare. This was now purely a digital sampler for the industry, and was selling in the region of around £25,000 for a basic system. Moving on to 1985, we have the Series 3 Fairlight. And on the surface, it looks very similar, but you'll notice that the VDU with the light pen was dropped, mainly because components were becoming quite expensive, hard to come by, and there was a high failure rate on those parts. So a regular cathode ray tube display was implemented, and instead of a light pen, they used a tablet, like a graphics tablet, which works very much like an Apple touchpad, except you have to use the stylus, which is connected to the keyboard itself. The mainframe has changed slightly. As you can see, there's only one floppy disk drive, and now we have SCSI hard drives and tape drives for high capacity storage and backup. But the big difference with the Series 3 over the Series 2 was that this is now a 16-bit sampler. And this means that the clarity is unlike anything else that was on the market at that time. But of course, it came at a price premium. This machine could do 16-bit sampling up to 100 hertz, 100 kilohertz. It could have 16 voices, stereo sampling. It could do multiple forms of sequencing. You could sync to time code very easily with this, and lots of other features besides. And this was the system that kind of, I guess, probably sold the most over the years. And this was really the dawn of, high quality digital sampling. And it was also the first Fairlight that allowed for multi-sampling. So everything up to this machine, every instrument was a single sample that was stretched across the entire keyboard. With the Series 3, we could now multi-sample. So you could have half a dozen samples and only stretch them a few semitones either way to get the full range of the keyboard. So it meant that there was far less aliasing, far better quality, and far more authenticity in the sound. So to give you a timeline here, so 1975 was the M8, then the Series 1 debuts in 1979, Series 2 in 1982, the 2X, which introduced MIDI in 1983. What's interesting to note about that is that the system that Vogel came up with for the Fairlight's music keyboard to communicate the musical notes and velocities to the mainframe computer was about 95% of what the final MIDI spec turned out to be. So whilst you can't credit them with the invention of MIDI, their protocols were at the very foundation of the MIDI protocol, which of course is one of the most successful computer communications protocols of all time. 1985, Series 3, and then in 1989, the company goes bust. And before they do that, they produce a system called the MFX, which is essentially a Series 3 Fairlight with hard disk recording. So remember, this is 1989 with 24 tracks of digital hard disk recording in a computer that is also the premier digital sampler in the business. But unfortunately, the company went bust because these guys were inventors. They weren't businessmen. And sadly, the entire stock got sold off very cheap. That was fortunate for myself and my colleague Peter, because Peter, who was working there at the time, managed to buy up a lot of that stock, and we've been able to use that stock to keep the machines going over the years. They started up another company called Fairlight ESP shortly after the original company went bust, and produced the MFX2, which was an improved version of that original MFX. And there would be a third version of this that would drop the Series 3 functionality altogether. So the MFX2 is effectively the very last Fairlight to come out of Australia. And then in 2011, Peter Vogel decides that he wants to do a 30th anniversary recreation. And so he releases the CMI 30A. This is a modern PC with custom software and bespoke hardware, ironically obtained from the present day, or what was the present day version of Fairlight, because the company went on to become one of the biggest hardware suppliers to the post-production industry. And they were producing very powerful DSP cards and chips. And so Peter decided to use them, and they did the code for the system as well. Unfortunately, due to lots of legal wrangles, only 14 of these machines were ever produced, and production had to stop whilst Peter had to go to court to get his money back from the Fairlight company that for want of a better phrase, screwed him over. So that doesn't mean that we don't have examples of Fairlight in the modern world. Of course, there are plugins now, and this is one of them. This is the Arturia Cmiv. This takes the factory library and presents a Fairlight here for your use, but it resembles the functionality very little, but it provides a much more modern interface and access to all of those classic Fairlight factory sounds. So the impact of the Fairlight on popular culture and popular music cannot be underestimated. Back in the day, one of these systems, as you can see here from this price list, this is a Series 1 Fairlight with Mark II channel cards, because that was always one of the objectives, was that they would produce a machine that they could then upgrade just by swapping the cards in and out. That started at £21,500. This is a Psycho price list from 83. You could have a slightly less spec machine for a mere 19,995. And then you could add in optional hardware such as extra channel cards, synchronization cards, an analog CV interface, which again are very, very rare, slave keyboards, line printers, boxes of discs, and even optional software such as the Page R sequencer, which was the first on-screen graphical sequencer ever. And all of these can be added on at the prices that you see here. But the impact that it had on music production was immense. And I often quoted as saying that the Fairlight was ground zero for the way we make music today with digital audio workstations. Without the Fairlight, none of these things would have existed in the way they do. But one of the big restrictions of the Fairlight was the fact that it was very, very expensive. And so companies decided to look at individual aspects of the machine to see if they could maybe do something similar at a cheaper price and cash in on this burgeoning market of sample enthusiasts. So we saw companies like Emu, led by Dave Rossum over in California, come up with the emulator range of samplers. And these were purely samplers. And they were very good samplers. And they were a lot less, although they were still quite expensive. An emulator one, I think, launched at around $10,000. But at the time, that was almost a third of the price of a Fairlight CMI. Only a few years later, we would see the real democratization of digital audio workstations, or certainly MIDI sequencers on computers, with the advent of the Atari STs and Amiga computers in the late 80s, that would then go on to become our PC DAWs that we were using in the 90s. And companies like Akai were producing very solid, professional, high capacity, very powerful digital samplers. And now, in the 21st century, everything's come back into the box. So it's kind of come full circle. We are now using a computer, just like the Fairlight, that can do all of our sampling and all of our sequencing and much more besides in a single device at a fraction of the cost. But there's nothing that can really quite beat the look and the sound and the feel of one of these things. And unfortunately, in a presentation such as this, I can't convey that to you directly. But if you are lucky enough to have one at the university, I urge you to go and explore it, because it will be an experience. And if you've never played with a Fairlight, you will have to effectively unlearn quite a bit before you start using it, because it's just doing things very, very differently. But once you get the hang of it, it's a real joy to use. And I really encourage you to do that. What did the Fairlight really change? So apart from the change in terms of the music technology that was being produced, where companies would say, well, we'll take the sampling aspect and we'll try and do something better, or we'll take the sequencing aspect. You've got this thing that users were now free to do so much more within a single environment, rather than having vast studios of gear. And the real liberator in this was Page R, which was the sequencer. So the Fairlight's originally shipped with a processing language called MCL, music composition language. And it was a coding language, and you had to understand the code syntax, and it was all text-based, and you would type in your notes and the durations and so on and so forth, and then process it, and it would play your music. When Page R came along, it was the first time that we could look at a screen and see the notes, see the durations of those notes, the positions of those notes, and place them on a grid or a track, either using our keyboards, our light pens, or even just placing them in with the alphanumeric keyboard. And this was a revelation, and it really revolutionized the entire industry. Because if you look at the variety of sequencers that are out there that have been around since the late 80s, they all follow this same track-based methodology. Some do things slightly differently, but even applications like Ableton Live, which is a very clip-based solution, has an option where you can flip to the more traditional linear format. But if you're using Logic, Cubase, Digital Performer, Studio One, Propellerhead Reason, or Reason Studios Reason as they call it now, you are in a very familiar environment. Yes, it's a lot more colorful, it's a lot more detailed, but this is where it all started. And with digital sampling, this was a revelation. People could sample instruments that they couldn't normally access, or in the hands of people like Peter Gabriel and many others, create new sounds from sources that were previously not even considered a musical source. You could take the smashing of a television set or the blowing across the top of a scaffold pipe and make it into a playable instrument. Better still, you could take a sound and slow it down so you could actually find the rhythm of the waveform and then use that as the basis for a sound. And Peter Gabriel's Rhythm of the Night is a perfect example of that. A pitch down sample that actually then reveals its rhythm through the fact that it's been slowed down so much, and it just inspired him to write a new song. And of course, sampling became incredibly popular, and it still is to this day. In fact, it's probably the standard way of getting sounds in and out of your computers or instruments in many ways. So we had the emergence of things like the EMU emulator, the Ensoniq Mirage, and of course Akai, who dominated the market with their rack samplers for many, many years. And of course, nowadays, our samplers aren't really samplers. For example, Kontakt here, you don't actually plug a microphone into your computer and sample into Kontakt. You record your sound or you import it from a file, and then you place it in here and you can map it and do certain things with it. But our samplers aren't really samplers anymore, unfortunately. There are some around, but predominantly Kontakt is just a sample playback device. In recent years, as I said, Peter Vogel came up with the CMI 30A, which was a very expensive, custom-built boutique thing that only sold 14 examples of. But he also came up with an application for the iOS platform, which is now called Vogel CMI. It just actually received an update this morning, the Pro version, to make it compatible with the latest versions of the operating system. And Peter designed this more as a historical artifact rather than a usable instrument, but it does both jobs quite well. It recreates page R, it recreates page D with its three-dimensional waveforms. It even recreates the sound of the floppy disk drives loading, and you can mess around with the power supply and have it burn out. So you could experience one of the most common faults that ever happened with the Fairlights. The number one reason for a Fairlight coming back to the factory was that the owners had not set the voltage correctly on the power supply because it was multi-voltage. So that's available in the App Store, and you can buy that now. There's a standard version and a Pro version that comes with extra library content, but it also has a history of Fairlight in there, and you can subscribe to their newsletter for updates. Another really great thing that has emerged in the last couple of years is an application called Quasar Beach, which is developed by a gentleman called Adam Strange. And this is a complete recreation in modern software of the Fairlight operating system and functions. So it's not using the original code. He has created this from the ground up using modern programming, but it replicates the way a Fairlight works almost perfectly. Now, obviously, it doesn't recreate the hardware, and so any sounds that you're playing back from this are not going to be processed through the Fairlight's typical sound processing hardware, but you will get a really good idea of how it is to use a Fairlight back in the day. And he's actually added some extra features, so you can use this with a MIDI keyboard. He's even added some Series 3 features in there, so you can flick between the 8-track Page R and the 16-track Page RS, which was in the Series 3. So you get a real kind of feel for how this thing works, and it's completely free of charge. So Google Quasar Beach, as it's shown here, and you can make a donation, and I highly recommend that you do, because Adam's done some sterling work. But if you don't want to, it is completely free of charge, and it works across Windows, Mac OS, and Linux as well. So please feel free to avail yourself of that and have a bit of fun. Unfortunately, it's a standalone application. It's not a plugin, so you can't use it in your DAW, but I'm sure that you can find ways around that. But it's great fun to sequence in Page R on this because it works pretty much exactly how it should do. So many classic Fairlight sounds exist, and there are very famous ones. And what I wanted to do was just to give you some examples. Now, unfortunately, my audio connections here aren't allowing me to play back some of these sounds for you, but I will give you some examples, and you can go to Spotify or Apple Music or whichever music streaming service that you use to find some of these examples. So the first most common one is the breathy vocal sound, which is often referred to as Syrah. And Syrah was actually named after the lady whose voice was sampled, Sarah Cohen. She had her voice sampled in 1981, and it has gone on to feature on some of the biggest hit records of all time, particularly during the 1980s. But even today, you can still sometimes hear this on certain pop records. One of the biggest users of it was, quite obviously, The Art of Noise. And Moments in Love, the key refrain in Moments in Love is all Syrah. Thomas Dolby was a big user of it as well, and you'll hear it pop up in all sorts of places. Of course, the most famous sound, I guess, if you were around at the time, it became almost too much to hear this on literally every single record, and that's the Orchestra Stab, sometimes known as Orc 5, but it was actually known as Orc 2. And this was just one of many examples where the names of samples got changed during the lifetime of the library. But it started off as Orc 2, and that's where it comes from. And the guy that you see here with the rather phallic instrument is Mr. David Warhouse. And David, who still has his studio in North London, which you see here, was a huge fan of the Fairlight. And actually, he still has the very first Fairlight that was imported into the UK by Peter Gabriel. It's still in his studio, albeit in quite a sorry state. But the story goes that Peter and David met in Switzerland at the I think it was an AES convention, an award ceremony in Geneva, where Peter had won an award for, did my, something just crashed there. Can you still see my screen?
Yeah.
Oh, that's odd. Let me just, that's probably just my computer. Right. So yes, so they met in Geneva in 1980. Peter was there to accept an award for the Fairlight, and David was there to accept an award on some experimental music that he created, or it might have been actually the instrument that you see him holding there, the kaleidophone. Anyway, they hit it off when they met, found out they actually had shared the acquaintances of a lady in Australia at different times, but they became great friends and struck up the friendship. And David went to Peter's house in Sydney, and David doesn't get up before midday, and he got up around lunchtime. Peter had gone to the office, and there was a Fairlight in Peter's house. So David starts playing around with it, and he starts thinking, I might be able to sample something in here. And the first record that catches his eye is Stravinsky's Firebird suite. And it's this particular edition, the Philharmonia Orchestra, conducted by Joseph Cripps and Konstantin Silvestri, that he sampled that very famous Orchestra Stab from. And he literally just dropped the needle at the beginning of the Infernal Dance, I think is the name of the track. And it's that big chord that the orchestra plays that if you watch the piece live, it makes everybody jump because it's very quiet beforehand. So he records that, hence that very famous Orchestra Stab came into being and was used literally on every record for many years. One of the first to really popularize it was Africa Bambaataa and the Soul Sonic Force, where they found a Fairlight in the studio, had no idea how to use it, managed to load up a sound, and it just happened to be that patch. And then they, Africa and the name of the producer was in my head, Arthur Baker, literally with 2 pairs of hands playing octaves, and they played 8 notes of this Orchestra Stab throughout the song, and it has this massive kind of sonic impact, especially in a club. Another popular sound was the Swanny Whistle. Again, famously used by China Crisis, Thomas Dolby, and many others. It was just simply a Swanny whistle playing a single note up and down the range, and had a very nice effect. Coolstab is an interesting one. This was sampled by J.J. Yexalik of The Art of Noise, and it was a sample from a really obscure funk song. And it's called the song was called "Cool Is Back" by a band called Funk Inc. And in fact, if you listen to "Owner of a Lonely Heart," you'll hear multiple samples from that record peppered throughout, particularly the brass sound that is used as a crescendo to the middle eight. And so that's a really popular sound, not featured on the factory library, but nowadays when you buy the plugins, it tends to be there. And of course, one of the other famous ones was the famous car starting sample used again by The Art of Noise, making rhythms out of the sounds of car engines. You know, how great is that? One recommendation I would say, if you want to hear real inventive use of the Fairlight in terms of found sounds, is a compilation by The Art of Noise called "And What Have You Done With My Body, God?" And it's a full CD compilation of early Art of Noise outtakes where they're really experimenting, and it's really interesting. And last but not least, Terminator 2. And I really like to show this one, but unfortunately, you know, the sounds aren't playing for me here. But there is a patch on the Series 3 Fairlight called Brass Fall. And when you play it at the correct pitch, it's 4 trumpets or maybe some trombones as well, just playing a brass note and then letting the pitch fall, which was a fairly common type of thing with brass sounds back in the day. Brad Fiedel decided to play that 3 or 4 octaves down, and he came up with the drone sound that heralded the arrival of the Terminator in Terminator 2, the bad one, not the good one. And it simply was just a brass fall patch knocked down about 3 octaves. Very, very simple. So there's really inventive uses of those sounds. And again, I'd recommend you listen to those. I want to just wrap up with this kind of little happy family story, and this the story about a single Fairlight that was bought by Trevor Horn. Trevor didn't really understand how to use it, so he got a guy to come in and do that, and that guy was J.J. Yexalik, who would then go on to be part of The Art of Noise. But a little bit previous to that, this guy, one of my all-time heroes, Malcolm McLaren, approached Trevor and asked him if he would produce an album for him, which was going to be a concept album based around what we now know as world music. So he got into Burundi music, he got into bluegrass music, the folk music of South Africa, and rap and hip hop, which was being considered the folk music of its day in New York. And he wanted to blend all of these things together. And so Trevor said, yeah, we'll do that. And we'll go and make all of these recordings in various places, brought it back into the studio and started getting JJ to feed it into the sampler. And you can, when you listen to the Duck Rock album, which was the album that eventually came out of this project, you can hear examples of the Fairlight all the way through, you know, from the programmed drum beats, which in some cases sound very much like The Art of Noise, to orchestra stabs and Syrahs and all sorts of, you know, classic Fairlight patches. So Trevor was this guy who owned the Fairlight, and the album is Duck Rock, which I still think is one of the greatest and most underrated albums of all time. And this was JJ. So the production of that album formed a team around Trevor, which consisted of JJ, Gary Langan, who was an engineer, and Anne Dudley, who was a burgeoning composer and who would go on to many, many great things, scoring movies and TV shows and being part of The Art of Noise. And Trevor took that team to his next project, which was Yes. Trevor had been a part of Yes a few years before, and that hadn't gone maybe as planned, but they asked him back to produce their new record, which they wanted to produce to really crack the album charts. And this was 90125, which is probably one of their most successful albums, if maybe not their greatest moment. But it would feature Trevor Horn again behind the desk, with JJ and Gary and Anne providing all of the technical expertise with the Fairlight. And if you listen to that album, particularly Owner of a Lonely Heart, you'll hear that Fairlight all the way through. After the sessions had finished, JJ and Gary would go away and take the tapes that had been discarded, and Trevor would normally insist on those tapes being destroyed. Instead, he actually gave them to JJ and Gary. They went back and fed these sounds, so sounds of Alan White's drumming, sounds of Trevor Rabin's guitar, into their Fairlight CMI, which was owned by Trevor, and started coming up with what would become the very first Art of Noise EP, Into Battle with the Art of Noise. They took these recordings to Trevor. Trevor really liked them. And the rest, as they say, is history. But this album, particularly this EP, has been often credited as one of the Kickstarter albums of the whole hip hop scene, because Africa Bambaataa used to go out and find these obscure records such as this, or albums by Kraftwerk, and take samples from these. And that big hip hop boom that happened in the early 1980s has often been credited, particularly the beats, to the Art of Noise, which is very odd that four people actually from England have had such an influence on what is often seen as a deeply American genre. So I would highly recommend listening to this EP, the Duck Rock album, the Yes 90125 album, and appreciate that there's this thread going through, which is Trevor and JJ and this one CMI that peppers all of those records, along with other great ZTT productions such as Frankie Goes to Hollywood. They're all connected by this one machine. And that, ladies and gents, brings me to the end of my presentation. So I hope that's been instructional, informative. You've enjoyed it, maybe learned something, and maybe you'll go away and reappreciate the instrument. And if you are one of the lucky ones that can get to the one that they have at Keele, please do, because it will be a revelation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. That was so fascinating. I'll open up for questions now, but maybe you want to unshare your screen so we can see people. And
absolutely.
Does anyone have a question for Rob?
Oh, there are lots of people here.
I'll ask a question.
Go ahead.
What do you think was the reason for its downfall?
In terms of the business?
Sorry, I'm muting myself then. Yeah, in terms of it, the company going bankrupt and the end of the... I mean, obviously the industry was moving on at that point.
Yeah.
So I'm just interested in your thoughts on why the Fairlight
disappeared
and became replaced by other things.
Yeah. So the first thing, I mean, obviously it was a very expensive machine, and everything was hand built in a factory in Rushcutters Bay in Sydney, and the costs were just astronomical, and that's why they charged. They didn't just pluck a price out of the air. It was huge manufacturing costs, and of course, being in Australia with most of the industry they wanted to appeal to being in America or in the UK, shipping was an absolute fortune, because these things are very, very heavy and delicate as well. So there's lots of bad business decisions, and that's basically because as most inventors and creators, such as Dr. Bob Moog, or the people behind the Synclavier, or other, they're focused on the technology. They're not focused on the business, and unfortunately, they didn't recruit enough people to manage that side. And so when the technology prices started to tumble, they decided to go the path of top of the line, high prices. And the industry started to say, well, actually, I can go out and buy an emulator for a third of the price, or an Akai for less than that. And in 1989, Atari STs, Amigas were just a few £100, and you could buy an Akai rack sampler for maybe £1,000. So let's say conservatively, a couple of £1,000 could get you an on-screen sequencer and a digital sampler, compared to £25,000 to £50,000, depending on the specification. So it was really just bad business decisions, and not being able to shift with the times properly.
Thank you.
Actually, I can add something to that. I met Peter and the two inventors from Australia. They came over to Psycho.
Oh, yes.
One of the questions I put to them was, how confident were they that the Fairlight was going to remain one of these sort of prestigious instruments? And they got perhaps a little bit of an arrogance, but they said they had no worries whatsoever. The R&D in their team, they reckon, was not being matched by Yamaha and Akai. And I think they were wrong, because I think the Akai sampler is one of the things that killed the Fairlight off a bit.
Absolutely, yeah. Couldn't agree more. I mean, it was cheaper, it was smaller, it was simpler to use, didn't make so much noise. I mean, if you've ever been in the room with a Fairlight and you turn it on, it's a noisy thing. And so it generally had to be housed in another room somewhere. But yeah, there was an arrogance about them, but it stood them in good stead, I think, in the early days. But yeah, people just came along and did it better, did it cheaper, and they didn't keep up with the times.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to come in and add something, Rob. Hi there.
Hello, Paul. How are you?
Good to see you.
You too.
Yeah, I think that's right. That certainly what comes across in the research I've done is there was an arrogance and possibly a bit hubris as well. Certainly at Psychosystems, in terms of the advertising campaigns got grander and grander and more exclusive. And I think that it certainly seems to be a conflict within Psychosystems where certain people, I think, saw the writing on the wall and kind of jumped ship because they were over in America and they were seeing the new cheaper samplers. They knew what was coming from Japan, and yeah, I think clearly within the matter of months that the company was clearly kind of on a downward trajectory. Yeah. So it's a fascinating story, I think, in terms of its initial success, but then then it's kind of failure to adapt, or still a failure to maybe try and produce something more mass market, instead continuing to focus on their kind of core market of rich rock and pop stars,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because companies like Akai, Yamaha all had access to large scale manufacturing processes, and Fairlight was still, in a small factory in the middle of Sydney, downtown Sydney, and they just couldn't scale, I guess, and produce something. They tried other things. They had the computer video instrument that was quite revolutionary at the time, but bottom line is, Peter and Kim were just not business people and didn't see the writing on the wall and didn't, shift and adapt as they should have done. It's actually interesting. There's an advert somewhere that you can find. I've got it in my archive, where I think it might have been Psycho, it might have been Fairlight themselves, advertised options for the Series 3 Fairlight, one of which was a 32 voice option, so it's double the polyphony. And I'm often asked, how can you get hold of a 32 voice Fairlight? And the simple answer is there was never such a thing. This was marketing over promising. And they actually found that it was cheaper to buy 2 Fairlight Series 3s than it was to build a 32 voice Fairlight. So, this was a case of marketing over promising. And then, of course, the likes of Akai could come along and offer greater polyphony and speeds and stuff. So, yeah.
Any other questions?
Anybody want to buy one? We've got some.
I think Miroslav's got a question for you.
Yeah.
Hi, Rob. Thank you very much. It was fantastic, really. Now I realized how ancient I am. I owned Atari 1040.
Oh, yes.
With the built-in MIDI. It was in 1988, I think I bought it. That's my first computer. My question is, are any ideas or any parts of the platform might have been borrowed by the creators of the TOS system in Atari? Or you don't find any connections? Because I see some of the logic that unfortunately died with the for Atari as a company have not been taken up anywhere. Even Mac didn't follow that route. I really missed Atari. I think it was one of the best systems I've ever seen for music production. Yeah.
Yes, it was a great. I mean, I used the Atari sort of in between my Commodore 64, which was my first sequencer, and then eventually in the early 90s a PC. And it was such a very simple. I still have an Atari emulator on my Mac just for kind of reminiscing how fun and easy it was to use, and also it's very helpful to convert old data. But are you asking if there was any kind of code share between Fairlight and I couldn't say. I guess you'd have to ask the Atari developers. But I do know that Fairlight as a business and as a technology developer are still very highly regarded. I know that when Peter Vogel submitted the first iteration of the iOS app, that he was contacted by a raft of high-ranking people at Apple because they were all huge Fairlight fans. They saw it as a significant step, in their, in the history of music and computing. So there's a lot of big fans at Apple for them. But whether any code was shared, I honestly don't know. I'll ask Peter and I'll see if I can find that one out for you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Rob, I had a question.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, in terms of the samples that were provided for each of the 3 versions of the Fairlight, what was there any distinct difference when they were released? Or
yeah, so it's an interesting thing because the factory libraries that came with the Fairlight were all developed in-house. And when somebody bought a Fairlight, you got what was that version of the factory library at that time. But there was no real, nowadays, everything's like, released, point release, 1.1, 1.2, 1.1 point whatever. Everything's kept a track of. Back then, it was just like, well, these are some sounds on floppy disks and have at it and do what you will with them. Or most importantly, make your own. And what would often happen is that machines would come back into Fairlight and they would come back with some floppy disks that contain new sounds. And then Peter Wilk would sit in the studio and say, oh, I like that one. I'll put that onto the factory library, because there was no legal comeback. Nobody really understood what the legality of sampling was all about back then. It was all very new. So the library was very organic and it evolved. There is kind of a fixed Series 2 library that's pretty much standard, but you'll find that in some cases the names change, but the samples are still the same. So Sarah, for example, is often called just ARR, and then it became Sarah. And I think there's a couple of versions of that with H in the name as well. So, they're all the same sounds, but the names changed. The Series 3 was more defined in that it came with an original Series 2 library, and it also came with its own Series 3 library, but it also saw the dawn of third-party sample libraries. So you had companies now independent of Fairlight going out and recording strings and brass, like ProSonus would do some amazing libraries. And also, when I spoke to Steve Levine a couple of years ago, or almost a couple of years ago, he said that there was also this competition between producers. So he and Trevor Horn would often swap samples, and Trevor would call Steve up and say, what's that? And Steve would say, oh, it's this. And Trevor would say, can I have a copy of that? And it would turn out it would be an emulator sample. So Steve would record or sample that emulator sample into the Fairlight, send it across to Trevor, who would import it into his Fairlight. And then you start to get this cross-pollination of samples from different manufacturers in the library. And then that causes confusion later on down the line because nobody really knows where the original sample came from. So a great example of that is the shakuhachi sound that Peter Gabriel used at the beginning of Sledgehammer. And who was that band? It was, Enigma, used it literally every track. That shakuhachi sound was originally accredited to the Fairlight, but it actually came from the emulator library. But it got to the Fairlight via an Akai, because a former colleague of mine, Steve Howell, sampled it from the emulator into an Akai, and then it got into a Fairlight that way, and then it just becomes all muddled. And so you get this very muddled history of the genesis of some of these sounds. And so whilst there are some very obvious Fairlight sounds, there's lots of cross-pollination, lots of synclavia as well got into there, because very few people had them. So when they heard the sound they liked, the iconic gong from the beginning of Beat It, you'll find that in most emulator or Fairlight sample libraries somewhere, but that's a synclavia. That's an FM instrument from the synclavia. So, yeah.
Any other questions? I know we've gone over time here, but if there's any other questions, please go ahead.
If anybody's interested in buying one, this is not a sales plug, but we do have them available. So if you are interested, just get in touch. It's one of those things that we do. Obviously, in these current times, it's difficult to move things around, but we service and maintain a lot of these machines. There are still plenty out there, thankfully.
was going to say I was in touch with Peter Wilk back in 2019 because we had a problem with our Fairlight, and that everything worked fine, but there's no sound that came out of it.
Right.
And I described the symptoms, and he said it looked like it was probably a fault in the main keyboard.
Yes.
And I started getting in touch with him, and he said, yes, he got the circuit board we could replace. But in the meantime, I thought, I wonder if I could have a go at myself. So I took the keyboard apart and looked at the main circuit board. And I thought, it's probably a good chance it might be the voltage regulators. So I took every single voltage regulator out, replaced them, cost about £5, and lo and behold, it solved it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, well, it's nice to know that there are plenty of parts around still.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of parts that are still fairly common. There are obviously some parts that are quite unique or no longer made. But, for example, the Series 2 that I have at the back of the studio there is running an SD card drive. So we no longer have to have floppy drives in there, which are noisy, clunky, and very limited in their size. I've got a 4 megabyte SD card in there. It's got all the libraries on it and plenty of space. Yes, it's based on the French design, Jean Bernard Imon, the Muse Studio one. So we've adapted that and just put that into there. And on the Series 3s, we use SCSI to SD card drives, which are just tiny little PCB with a micro SD card slot. We put a 16 gigabyte one of those, format it into four gigabyte partitions, and that's plenty of storage for a Series 3 Fairlight. And it takes away all the noise and the heat and the power consumption of the big unwieldy Winchester hard drive. So lots of things that can be adapted and replaced. We've not found anything yet, I think, that we can't. We've even actually found replacement alphanumeric keyboard parts for the early ones, and also light pen parts. They're not cheap, but they can be fixed. So they're good to go for a little while, hopefully.
Good.
Nick's got a question for you.
Yeah.
Hi Rob, thanks for a fascinating talk. You mentioned Arturia in the middle of that. I just wondered what you thought about these people who kind of do these sort of soft synth emulations. What's your sort of general thoughts on that?
I think it's great that it puts those sounds into the hands of people that want them. I think most of the people I speak to, when I say, they say, "Oh, I'd love a Fairlight," I ask them why they would love one, because having used them, they're not easy to use. They're unintuitive compared to what we have nowadays. But 99%, and that's not a scientific figure, but the vast majority say, "I want those sounds. I want those classic sounds." And so I just say, well, get the plugin, because you have all of those sounds, and in the mix, you're not going to know whether that's a genuine Fairlight or a plugin. And you get access to all of those sounds, and a much more intuitive and easier to understand interface. And I like what Arturia did with Page R, for example. They cleaned it up. It looks nice, but it retains an essence of the original functionality, which is really nice. And they've also got, the sampling pages are reminiscent, but not identical. And you can manipulate the sounds. The only drawback, and I have the CMIV plugin. I love it. I use it a lot because it's a lot easier than firing one of those up. But my only quibble is that they don't fully recreate the audio path. And so they don't recreate the processing that created the character of the sound. And it really is a very unique character. You can only experience it in the room with a Fairlight. The sound quality is quite phenomenal. And sometimes in a rough way. And they can't, because to model the internals of the CMI to do exactly what it was doing to create that character is just inefficient in terms of CPU power. When you're running a Logic with 20 or 30 plugins at one time, you want as much headroom in your CPU usage, and this would just use it up. That's not to say that it won't happen, I'm sure, in the future, and I'd love to see it. And there is actually a French guy called Ali James who is developing a version of the Fairlight, and he thinks he's managed to do it. So I'm really interested to see that. And then you've got Quasar Beach, which obviously isn't a plugin, but it gives you the experience, and it's free and it's great fun to use. So I'm all for good recreations of instruments that no longer exist. I don't have any problems with somebody buying a CMIV and not spending £10,000 on a restored and refurbished Series 3, because it means they get to play with those sounds, and the history goes on, which is what I really want to do.
last questions? No? Okay,
Nope.
we'll finish there then. Thank you again, Rob. That was
More than welcome.
such a great talk. Really, really useful. I think we could carry on talking about this for a long time.
I could.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone else for coming along. We'd normally clap at this point, but I don't know.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. And say, I'm really glad you enjoyed it, and happy to come back at any time. Got FM. That's my next thing. That's my next project. So
definitely. Great. Thank you.
Cheers then.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.